Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bale here, coming to you with yet another Alberta election forecast. Now, this one is different. Now, you'll see here, I still have Notley as the leader of the NDP, but that is no longer true. But we'll get more of that in a second. Before we begin the rest of the video, would like to shout out to all the channel members. Thank you for supporting the channel. It greatly helps. And if anyone else wants to support my channel, by all means, like, share, subscribe. Or if you do have the money, think about becoming a member below. It adds a lot of stability and confidence into the channel and makes me be able to invest and do better things going forward. But with no further ado, let us begin. Oh, actually, sorry, I have one ado. My upload schedule is going to be probably a bit more up in the air for the next little bit. I have recently purchased myself a house, and I'm also getting married this year, so I'm quite busy. So I might not be able to get every single week, but we're going to do my best. And then after July, everything should be back to normal, hopefully. But we'll see. But no further ado, let us begin. So, Notley has just recently announced that she is going to step down as leader of the Alberta NDP. This isn't really a surprise for anyone who's been following the situation. Notley herself has been the leader since, I believe, 2013. Correct me if I'm wrong there in the comments below, but over a decade now, she's been the leader of the party. And in that time, she's been premier for 4 years, and she's had 2 close election results. Not quite enough to win, but fairly close, like a good performance, all things considered. But now, she's stepping down. She's retiring. And this, again, shouldn't be that surprising. Usually, leaders only stick in for 3, 4, sometimes 5 elections, even if they are winning them. It's rare you see someone stay as the leader of a party for much more than a decade. It does occasionally happen. We do have people like Trudeau Sr. or Mackenzie King who were party leaders for decades. But it rarely happens, especially if you are a leader who's lost elections. Usually, 2-ish lost elections is enough for someone to step down. Now, in the case of Notley, I don't think, strictly speaking, she's stepping down because she lost. I think she's stepping down because she's getting old. Now she's, I believe, 60. Correct me if I'm wrong there in the comments below again. And by 2027, the next election, she'll be looking at 63, would be looking at 67 if she won that election by the time she retired, or by the time the next election happens in 2031. It's understandable in that she doesn't really want to do that anymore. Especially since she was premier. She knows everything that goes, she knows everything that is involved with being in power and actually governing, which is one of the things that holds people back, keeps older politicians in office, is they haven't actually won elections yet. Or they have already won and they just keep winning. That's why in the US, for example, you have people like Mitch McConnell who are still in office. They're old, yes, but they've just kept winning. You rarely see an old person lose an election and then run again. Someone like Trump doing that is very rare. And it's really because people who've been in political office, who've had power, and who are old, know how exhausting it is. They don't really want to do it again. There's other reasons, sure, as well. There's been some rumors, too, I can't substantiate these, but that the base of the Alberta NDP is getting restless with Notley because she's seen as too centrist. Some I've even seen her describe her as center-right, which is silly, but whatever. So if she's having an unruly caucus or an unruly base, or at least unruly enough, she's getting old, she just lost an election, it's understandable why she would want to retire at this stage. And you can't say she's retired a political failure. She's won an election in Alberta as the NDP. Was the first NDP win in Alberta. The first at least nominally conservative party to win Alberta since the 30s. That said, that legacy is gone now. She's retiring. And even on the eve of her retiring, we see here, because there's only been one poll, which is in this model now, since she announced publicly she was retiring. And that poll did show, it was a ledger poll, it showed an 11-point lead for the UCP in popular vote, which is quite significant in and of itself. The previous ledger poll, which was just a week before, 1 week earlier, only had a 7-point lead. So the mere change in leadership, just her outgoing, her resigning, represents a 4-point shift. And for the Alberta NDP, there really isn't much going optimistic in the wings here. For the NDP to win an election in Alberta, they either need to win substantial parts of rural Alberta or sweep Calgary. Nearly sweep Calgary, I should say. We look at this map here. We're at 56 to 31. They need 44 to win. Where can they get 13 seats? Well, if you look at the most marginal ridings in Calgary, there's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, that's 9. Look at Lethbridge, 10, 11, 12, 13. Like, the path is there. But that would require them winning every marginal seat. Not impossible. They came somewhat close to that in 2023. Not that close. People overstate how close that was, but they came somewhat close to it. It was, in theory, reachable. However, with Notley gone, the Alberta NDP has lost a big asset. Someone who, for better or worse, could appeal to more centrist voters in Alberta. Someone who could contrast themselves quite cleanly to Smith. Smith, her main fault as a politician is her penchant for saying controversial things. Now, I think people overblow how bad that is, but it is a feature, a trait that she has. And it can lead her to unfortunate moments, awkward moments. But unfortunately for the NDP, there's really not many options in the wings. And there is a big concern that they might have is if the base of the party does what a lot of the NDPs nationally have done and goes with the feel-good option and elects a left-winger, someone, say, like Janice Irwin, that could very well cause them to plummet and lose a lot of ground. And, well, historically, the Western, Prairie, and BC provinces have done a good job of electing more centrist NDP leaders. Wab Kinew in Manitoba is a good example. Not particularly left-wing. He is definitely center-left, but he's not outrageously so. Someone like that would probably do okay in Alberta. Hard to say if Wab Kinew himself would do better than Notley, or worse, but there is a path in theory there. But moving to a more solidly left-wing candidate, which in the eastern half of the country, Ontario, Maritimes, and if you count Quebec Solidaire as sort of the NDP in Quebec, the NDP really likes electing like solid left-wing choices. People with very firm left-wing bona fides. And that would be a big mistake for the Alberta NDP. But they're probably going to do that either way, because even if I say this, they're going to not believe me. It's been many times, actually, on Twitter where I have said that Singh is doing a mistake here or there, and then NDPers will push back and say, no, Singh is doing good things. No, he's not. He's a failure. And actually, Singh is another prime example of this. He is the national NDP leader, and he's nothing like people like a Jack Layton or Wab Kinew or even David Eby. He's to the left of all of them. And not in a productive way. Not in a useful way. In a kind of virtue signaling, pat on the back kind of way. And that's the dangerous situation the Alberta NDP face themselves in. Because if they do a standard leadership race, there's a very good chance that in 2024, they're going to pick someone like that. If they do a caucus nomination, it's almost certain they're going to pick someone like that. And it will not go over well. If there's anything that would make Danielle Smith be able to break the last 20 years of Albertan history of not ever having a premier get reelected, it would be that. It's the prime issue the left-wing Canada is facing, and one of the reasons why federally they're failing, and provincially they have failed quite spectacularly in places like Nova Scotia or Ontario. Alberta itself, though Notley wasn't too bad. But we go look at, say, Ontario as an example. Why did Ford win 2022? It's not because Ford is the best candidate. It's not because Ford is the best politician. It's not because people even like Ford. He's not liked. It's because his opponents was an uncharismatic, generic cabinet minister from an unpopular government, or a very left-wing NDP leader. He won by default in a lot of ways. And this is why, and this is where this becomes quite concerning, even if you are a UCP supporter. You don't particularly want the NDP to run super left-wing candidates, because then it lets UCP leaders, or in the case of Ontario, PC leaders, be weak and ineffective because they don't actually have a threat. They have no electoral challenge. Just federally, we can see why this is important and how Trudeau behaved before and after O'Toole. When O'Toole was in charge of the Conservative Party, Trudeau just kind of did whatever he wanted. Because O'Toole wasn't a real threat to O'Toole. He wasn't a real challenge to O'Toole. Poilievre, though, has been. And Trudeau has had to at least try to smarten up. We would not be seeing potential restrictions in student visas, which are being talked about right now, if O'Toole was still the leader. And it's worth noting that Poilievre wasn't even really stumping on restricting student visas. Just the mere presence that he was a threat forced Trudeau to take serious action about housing and try to start doing things to actually help the problem. Which is why you don't actually want people to elect ineffective leaders. That's not good for the health of your country. But unfortunately, that really seems to be what the NDP right now wants to do. I don't think someone like Kinew in Manitoba would have been elected today. If he was the NDP nomination, I should say. He kind of skips through because he was elected the leader well before. All the way back in 2017, sorry. And that might not sound like that. That's only 7 years. But there is a really big difference here. The culture, especially on the left, has changed dramatically since 2017. It's very different now. Someone like Canoe would not win again. At least, I don't think he would. Now, you might ask yourselves, if it's bad for the NDP to run firmly left-wing candidates, why is it actually good that the Conservatives have run someone like Poilievre who is more firmly right-wing? Why is it good that the UCP have run someone like Smith, who is very, quote-unquote, right-wing by popular conception? Well, there's a difference there. And the difference is in voter bases. If you look at polls and you look at the data, a lot of people who would be conservative voters under, say, O'Toole didn't vote. They stayed home. They weren't inspired by someone like O'Toole. They didn't want to vote for him. And now, why is this? Well, there is this tendency among the right, more so than the left, though both sides have this, that the right-wingers are more willing to just not vote. They won't usually settle for good enough. Left-wingers are much more willing to settle for good enough. That's why you see in the US, for example, Democratic Socialists support Biden, even though Biden is not that at all. He's just better than the alternative. They're more willing to back him. This is not a thing in the right. Now, conversely, there is a tendency that if a leader is well respected, that leader will encourage all the people of that political inclination to vote for them, regardless of policy. And that's why someone like Poilievre is able to do so much more than someone like O'Toole could. O'Toole wasn't very well respected because he didn't have solid right-wing credentials. He didn't do the policies people wanted. He didn't say the things people wanted to hear. So he wasn't well respected. So you did not have a rallying behind the leader effect for him. And since he wasn't very right-wing, a lot of would-be right-wing voters just stayed home where they voted PPC. They just couldn't stomach voting for him. The left doesn't experience this to the same degree. As I already said, they're more willing to just vote for the leader just because they're the best choice. They're the least bad option. And in a lot of ways, the left doesn't really have the same rallying behind the leader effect. It sort of does happen, but it's not to the same degree because, at least in theory, the left likes to treat itself as more egalitarian than the right does. In a lot of sense, most right-wingers don't really fully believe in equality, at least to a certain degree. They're much more innately hierarchical. That's one of the differentiating factors between conservatism and liberalism. But the left likes to treat itself that it's more egalitarian, so they're less willing just ideologically to follow the leader regardless of what the leader says. They don't just innately trust the leader if they respect them. That's not, the right is more willing to do that. That's how you see people like Trump do so well in the US, because people in the right in the US respect Trump. Some don't, sure, but many do. So they're willing to go with him regardless of exactly what he says, exactly what his character is, because they respect him. So what does this mean here? Well, it's likely, since, as I just said, the left is more ideological today. They're less pragmatic than they were in the past. I think that's probably generational turnover. I think Gen Z tends to be, and millennials tend to be more ideological than Gen X has been, and boomers are really aging out, and they were more liberals than anything else. The actual people voting in the nomination race are going to be mostly millennials and Gen Zs, probably. And since they're more they seem to be more ideological based on polling, I think you're likely going to see the NDP elect a more ideological leader, as, again, we've seen in every eastern province recently. And arguably, even in Saskatchewan, they elected a more ideological leader than they should have. So we're likely going to see that again. And a more ideological leader, let's just say, because I don't know for certain, let's say it's a Janice Irwin type, is probably going to flop quite poorly. Or quite happily? I don't know. Pick your adjectives there. Because the path to victory in Alberta for the NDP requires winning these 9 seats in Calgary that the UCP are currently leading. They also need to pick up 4 more other seats, but they need these 9. There's really nowhere else in Edmonton that can grow other than those 2. There's only 2 more seats that can really grow in Edmonton. There's only really 2 they're competitive in rural Alberta. So they need to win these 9. Maybe if they do really, really well, some others might open up, but for now, they need to win these 9. That means they need to win Calgary. Okay. What does winning Calgary entail? Well, that means they have to be trusted on things like public safety, on the economy, on oil. Oh, well, that's not great already. Because those are not things that the NDP traditionally does well with. And a more ideological NDP leader is very likely going to alienate people in the oil industry, in the oil sector, and people who believe oil is really important for the Albertan economy, which is one of the overdriving reasons why the province votes right-wing today. Is the left is anti-oil, and the province is rich only because of oil. All the social services that Albertans experience are literally only sustainable because of oil. There's no sovereign wealth fund in Alberta, which is possibly a bad thing. Depends on your perspective. But I've seen persuasive arguments that it's a really bad thing the Alberta didn't invest heavily in a sovereign wealth fund. But the consequence of not investing in that is they're allowed to have really low taxes for the amount of public service they get. The Alberta has the most public spending per person in the country, and also the lowest taxes in the country. Most Albertans are aware of this, at least in theory. They might not know the exact numbers, but they know oil allows us to have more public services for the amount of taxes we pay. So Albertans tend to be very defensive of the oil industry. That's why, again, the province is so conservative right now. More so than it has any right to be. Places like Calgary, by global standards, should not be a very conservative city. A conservative city really should just be an oxymoron. That just shouldn't exist in the current political climate, but it does. And it's, again, 3 letters. Oil. But there's more. There's a growing concern about parental rights in Alberta specifically, but Canada as a whole. The NDP is on the wrong side of that discussion. There's growing opposition to immigration across the country, and the NDP is firmly on the opposite side of that equation. UCP is hard to say where they are right now, but they benefit from the NDP more strongly drawing that line, which a more ideological leader would do. The only 2 topics that the NDP benefits from being more ideological on is healthcare and to a lesser extent, education. But education's getting eroded because people are losing trust in the education system as is. And the less trust they have in it, the more they're going to want things like school choice or drastic overhaul of the school system. And a drastic overhaul of the school system is going to probably lead them to a conservative position, not the NDP position. So there's really not much to be gained for the Alberta NDP from going to the left. They already probably win the healthcare argument. They're already doing okay on education in general. Being more left-wing doesn't help them there, but it does alienate them on things like the economy, on oil, public safety. And you could argue and quibble about how important or how real those concerns are, but the thing that really matters in elections isn't necessarily what the strict reality of the issue is. Is the NDP actually better at running a healthcare system? I don't know. Does it matter? Probably not. That's what voters think. Does it matter if the UCP is better at the economy? No. Voters think they are. That's what matters. If you want to actually look down and really analyze the fine details of who was actually literally better, that is a different conversation, but it's not one that voters care about. In general, elections are more about vibes than they are about facts. And this isn't actually a bad thing. Now, that might sound outrageous. How is it not a bad thing that elections are sort of about vibes? Well, fundamentally, what is an election? You're trying to decide who the leader is, who should be in charge of hard decisions. Okay, makes sense. Why do you need someone in charge of hard decisions? Well, because random things happen, unexpected things happen, and someone needs to make a decision. We need leadership. Okay, makes sense. How do you know who's going to be the best one at handling a pandemic when neither person has ever handled a pandemic? Who is the best one at handling a natural disaster when neither candidate has handled a natural disaster? Who's better at handling a major recession when neither candidate has ever handled a major recession? There is no correct answer to that question. It's impossible to know. The average voter can't know which leader will be better in a crisis unless that leader has already served as premier. It's the only way they can know. Period. Which is why elections are often more about vibes. Voters need to vote on vibes because the most important thing that a premier is going to do is just how they handle unexpected events. And you don't know how they're going to handle them unless they've been premier before. So all you can do is look at their character and be like, I think this person will be better. The fundamental reality is most things, healthcare, education, the economy, are largely run by the bureaucracy. That's not going to change that much. Yes, the premier, yes, budgets, yes, laws can all have an effect and it can do things. We're not powerless at the hands of the bureaucracy. But a bad leader and a good leader have much less difference on the economy than they do on handling unexpected events. A lot of things are out of their control. And yes, they do have control. I'm not saying there's no control. But I'm saying it's not enough for individual voters to really be able to suss out. After the election, after all the things have happened, we can sit down, we can crunch numbers, and we can say, under Trudeau, the economy performed worse than under Harper. Great. Could you have done that in 2015? Probably not. Some people said it would do that. They were right. But how would you know? How would you know? If you trust that expert with that analysis, you can just follow them and accept it. If you don't trust them, you cannot believe them. And for every person who said that the economy would get worse under Trudeau than it was under Harper, there are people who said the opposite. Famous example in the US, Paul Krugman, famous economist, said Trump winning would cause a recession. Didn't happen. At all. So if you trusted Paul Krugman's analysis, you'd be completely wrong on the economy. And that's the important thing here. A lot of these things are too complicated for someone who doesn't spend a lot of time studying it. That's why voters don't, strictly speaking, vote on, well, the NDP is going to do better in the economy because of X, Y, and Z. They're like, the NDP has this policy that I like. I want that policy. Or, I like Notley as a leader. That's how people really vote. They want a specific policy. They want a specific leader. Or they're voting against a specific leader or a specific policy. It's hard to make sweeping analyses of who is actually better at something. And then the consequence of that, since it's really hard to do this, is voters will create, for various reasons, usually fairly accurate, but not always, heuristics for who's better at what. And oftentimes the heuristics are basically based on who talks about what issue more. Why are the Conservatives perceived as better at the economy? Well, historically, maybe they did better. But also they talk about it more. They seem to care about it more. Why are the NDP conceived as better at healthcare? Well, maybe historically they did better with healthcare. But likely it's heavily because they talk about it more and they care about it more. Does it mean they're better at it? I don't know. Again, you'd need to look at some deep, complex economic studies to really know the answer to that. What we can say definitively is they care about it more. I'll give an example for Nova Scotia. Why did Tim Houston beat Ian Rankin? Well, healthcare was the number one issue, and Houston spent more time talking about healthcare. He cared about the issue more. And since voters were really concerned about that issue, and it was the main issue of the election, they voted for the person who cared about the issue more. Simple as that. Was it the correct decision? Was it the wrong decision? We'll never know. We can't know the alternative. We don't know what Ian Rankin would have done. And that's the really important thing here that I really want to stress in this video. Voters have to be met where they are. They might have wrong opinions, like objectively, quantifiably wrong. But that doesn't matter. What matters is how you interface with their perception. If voters perceive the NDP is strongest on healthcare and education, and they're bad at the economy, oil, public safety, and you elect someone who is even more left-wing, those perceptions will be more enhanced. They'll be greater. The consequence, though, is if you're already losing and you double down, you're going to double lose. And it doesn't seem very likely the NDP will elect a moderate leader. Now, maybe I'll be wrong, and they will. And I think that actually will be good for Alberta if they do. A moderate leader will put pressure and threat on Smith and make her be as good a governor, as good a premier as she can be. And that is something that Albertans actually should want. Now, as a UCP voter, you might not want Smith to lose, and that's fine. That's perfectly understandable. But you want Smith to be doing her A game 100% the entire time. Because if you don't have that, and you have the weak leadership we saw federally with Scheer and O'Toole, you get weak leadership from Trudeau. Trudeau had strong vision and relatively strong leadership in 15, 16. And he's had since then, at least trying to reclaim strong leadership since Poilievre. But between 17 and 23, he was just kind of coasting. He wasn't really trying. And it led to a lot of really terrible things in Canada. Massive housing price inflation, stagnant economy, increases in crime. That's the problem when a leader of a party, the leader of a government in a democracy, feels no opposition to them. They have no concern about failure. They're going to be weaker than if they had a concern about failure. But soon, we will see in Alberta who the NDP actually want to be. Even if they elect a terrible leader, 1, 2 election cycles, not a big deal for the party itself. If you start looking at 3 or 4, maybe someone like the Liberals or the Alberta Party could resurrect. But it's too early to call that because we don't know. But with that, I bid you all adieu, and I will see you, hopefully, next week with something different.